So my name is Sharon Heal. I'm a trustee of the European Museum Forum, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce this morning's second keynote, Elvira Dyangani Ose, who is the Director of Contemporary Art Museum, Barcelona. She was previously a director of the Showroom in London and curator of the 8th edition of the Gothenburg International Biennale for Contemporary Art and a curator of international art at Tate Modern. She's currently affiliated to the Thought Council at the Prada Foundation and recently joined the Tate Modern Advisory Council. When I spoke to Elvira before the conference to understand how I might introduce her and this session, she said that the title maybe should be The Possible Museum rather than A Possible Museum. So I think that might be an important distinction. But she also talked about creating a new mission and vision for the museum and looking at how they might include different voices in the museum space. We've heard some examples of that multivocal approach over the course of the past 2 days, from the Thackeray Museum of Medicine in Leeds to the Footwear Museum in Mallorca, and from the Workers' Museum in Copenhagen to the Museum of the Mind in the Netherlands, who we heard from this morning, and many, many more examples. And all of these museums are exploring ways in which we can make a possible museum or the possible museum of the future by giving voice often to those that are marginalized and those whose voices are unheard. In the United Kingdom, I'm very honored to be the chair of the Museum of Homelessness. One of our central tenets is that the voices and stories of those with lived experience of homelessness are at the center of the museum, but also at the center of decision-making. But being a museum, conceptually, can sometimes hamper that. So I hope Elvira will also explore what the challenges and restrictions are, and those restrictions that we face in creating new and possible museums. I often think that we have a weight of history upon us in museums. You only need to look at the beautiful buildings we've been in for this conference, the physicality of the building. We all have to face up to the history of our buildings, the history of our collections, and also the history of the way that others have created the museum before us. So I hope Elvira will also explore whether that is a solid foundation to build on or a framework that confines and restricts us. And if it's the latter, how do we break out of it? So it's my very great pleasure to hand over to our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you to Joan Roca, who insisted that I should be here with you today. It is really exciting for me that you ask some questions that are key to some of the things that we're trying to do at MACBA. Hopefully, some of you have already visited the museum while you have been here. I know it has been a busy program, and I'm sorry I have missed part of it, but I'm glad that we have that time to share. One of the things that Sharon and I suggested when we had a conversation is that we would like some sort of interaction. So I'm going to try to keep my presentation to 20 minutes so we have a time to discuss among us, but also hopefully you will also come to this conversation with your ideas, challenges, why not, and we will take it from there. I would like to take a minute to read, you can read yourself, this essay from the book Silencing the Past, Powers in the Production of History by the anthropologist, the late anthropologist Michel Rotrojot. Those of you who know me know that I really take on great deal to this author, but also I would like us to join me in reading this. We can not exclude in advance any of the actors who participate in the production of history or any of the sites where that production may occur. Next to professional historians, we discover artisans of different kinds, unpaid and unrecognized field laborers who augment, deflect, or reorganize the work of the professional as politicians, students, fiction writers, filmmakers, and participant members of the public. In doing so, we gain a more complex view of the academic history itself, since we do not consider professional historians the sole participants in its production. This, for me, is key. If we consider Troyot's statement in the museological context, history will be the history of art. Maybe academic history will be the institution as a site of its cultural production. And the professional historian role will be shared, let's say, among various degrees of capacity and responsibility between several experts that constitute the agents of the daily experience of any museums. Artists, museum directors, museum curators, department heads, conservators, archivists, educators, and so on and so forth. Central to this thought is the fact that, at least in theory, museums have long acknowledged the role of the potential artisans in their history making and in the pursuit of articulating its very specific collective agency and values. In this sense, my presentation here recognizes visitors, or better say viewers, users, participants, neighbors, and in the case of MACBA, skaters, tourists, communities, and even the clueless passerby at this raison d'être as the nucleus of a network of concentric circles around which all the activities, the vision, the future of the museum, and the future of the museum revolved. It is to that sense of the common, of the collective, of the plurality it offers for the formulation of a museum permeable to knowledge of all kinds, skillfulness and experience of those untimed, unpaid, or unrecognized labor who might augment, deflect, and reorganize the work of the museums. This proposal and the project that the museum, the MAC budget to come, are devoted. And it's interesting for those of you who know the museum, know that the building opens in 1995, and in the temporal framework that occurs after, let's say, the conceptualization of the museum in the mid-end of the 1980s, it has a very peculiar formulation to it because it was established on an unprecedented accord between the authorities of the regional government, the city government, and later on the national government, together with members of civil society. The pacta was called the Cultural Pactet, and the ultimate purpose was to develop new cultural policies beyond the political spectrum leading the constitution of the museum. The aim here was to avoid previous dichotomies, historically defined left and right-wing parties, to embrace culture as a galvanizer of a sense of togetherness for a greater good, for the sake of a healthier, more just public culture. The sites of production of this episode in the history of museum remain likewise critical as it takes in consideration the local art scene and the specific underground trends as they were several institutional gestures ahead of institution as such that needed to be acknowledged as the condition of possibility for the museum to emerge and as the birthplace of some of the experimental and more transdisciplinary aspects, practices, and discourses that led to the formation of the MACBA that we recognize today. And for me, the sense of what the museum constitutes in terms of its capacity to bring together this frame of possibility that I was talking about is the real birthplace of the museum. Not only the agreement, the political agreement, but the sense of a context and a scene that needed the museum to emerge. Those political gestures, those institutional gestures ahead of institution itself are critical to the understanding not only of the museums that we aim to recognize, but also the museum that we want to envision today and for the future. Because if we recognize the formation of the MACBA as something that happened prior to its constitution in political, social, and architectonic sense, we will be recognizing the necessary dialogue that needs to happen in every step of the future of the museum. So the underground transdisciplinary art scene, that those elements that have been key to the formulation of the museum are rooted in the context that make it possible. And I thought that I shared with you and Sharon some of the ideas around what had constituted the life of the museum, but also some of the challenges that it presented for its future, not only for us, but also for any museum of contemporary art in general. No? This notion, for instance, that the so-called neo-institutionality inscribed in a highly hierarchical institution focused on the director agenda, on an author's museum that is an indulgent, no matter how great it is, and it could be a missed opportunity, right? I think that sense in which the museums go beyond that necessary ethos or personal agenda is very important. And in that sense, of course, many of the references to the museums had to do as well with the notion of participation. But what does it mean to participate? What does it mean to create a museum that is open to people's needs and desire, communities' wishes, right? What is a democratic museum, which is the key thing that has been discussed here? And how can a museum support certain initiatives, but also recognize in itself the need to highlight also what we do within an economic and sociopolitical structure. No? Very important as well is that moment, you know, both, I think there was the clash between what will be a museum led by a director-curator's agenda was this other possibility of inviting people to a museum to participate, you know, in a very neoliberal way. You know? How can we discuss what that entails, and how can we impart certain politics of care that has to do, first and foremost, with our own communities, but also with our team, no? How we motivate our team to understand that the plural voice that the museum had to endeavor is also theirs, no? How we work around talent, how we empower the people that work with us. Nothing relative to the museum is any longer evident. The task of the coming year is to reinvent the institution. And I know it sounds very provocative, but this is something that we are trying very much to do with our projects. And in one of the cases is, for instance, the kind of exhibition for the collection that we're intending to produce, thinking about what will mean to disassociate in the project that you have these days if you come to MACBA, no? How can we disassociate the artwork from the museographic context that surrounds it? Could we, if that realm of possibility existed, to respond to the will of the world, to the desire and the energy of the art piece, to its poetic intention? Taking the title of the eponymous book of Martinican poet Edouard Glissant, Poetic Intention, the exhibition that presents from 2022 to 2024 the collection of MACBA, is conceived as an exercise of disruption from the museum institutional framework, offering a space for reflection and a critique where art is both a concept but also an experience, and is also formulated as an emancipatory force. This new approach to the collection featured to a large extent, artwork acquired in recent years that see new spaces for coexistence with existing works in the collection, but also works that enter into the collection for the first time that makes the narrative and the context more permeable and open. One of the things that perhaps I'd like to recognize here is both this sense in which the exhibition is an element or is a vehicle, let's say, for this sense of disruption of the dramaturgy of the museum, right? What is the dramaturgy of the museum, how that can be crossed. And here we have two works, one which is a permanent installation in our collection, the one of your right, which is Raisin from Antonio Tapies, and the one right in the center of the image is the work of Pep Duran, which invite us to cross it, to create this station, to be part of the staging of the work, as I said, to disengage and actively, ask our bodies to actively disengage from the museum's pre-established dramaturgy. But when we decided to, what do we do with the museum, one of the things that was clear to me that we needed to reflect on our own history, but also to be able to overcome it. And we started this project, which I say, the Possible Museum not only refers to the idea that there is a framework of possibility to operate, but also to the capacity of the museum to work within the framework that is established. And we know each of us have their own pressures and advantages. Each of us has its own systems of governance. But at the end of the day, what we all have is a framework of possibility from which we can change the world. Why not? No? And we started to consider that from the perspective of this notion of the possible museum, because in Spanish it's el museo posible, but in English it fluctuates between a possible museum, which could be any museum in the world, or the possible museum, being this the one. And I think for us, the possibility of working with the nuance of something that is not yet finished, that needs somehow this space of speculation, laboratory, and experimentation was very crucial. So here, a possible museum for us is not only the museum that could be, but is not, the ideal projection of some unfulfilled desire. The possible museum is also what can be done, the framework of possibilities that open up, yet are still restricted by what already exists. It is neither the avant-garde, impulse to produce anew while rejecting the past, nor the conservative instinct to perpetuate what is already established, but the affection with which we can take care of something for its own good, and not only or not always to make it grow. And that is important in relation to, for instance, the architectures, the elements that we live. And I love this advertising that was one that was in the early 2010s that was used, this idea that MACBA can be yours. And this is something that we have somehow worked around it from the perspective of our exhibitions and activities, but also from the perspective of our campaign and everything that we bring with the museum. One of the things that is important for us is this idea that the museum is both coherent in terms of its program as much as it is in terms of its politics, the governance, its administrative issues, etc. And one of the things that we start to discuss among us is how can we have a different relationship with our community? What can we do to make the museum radically public? What does even mean? Because we are a public service, and I'm very proud that MACBA continues to serve the public. We have activities, education activities, public programs. We have other, a lot of educational activities to the community. But what more can we do? Because that is already what we do. So if we want to be radically public, what else we need to think of? Is our new educational models, our provide the space to other things that happen? One key thing for us was to consider that this notion or the idea of giving back to the community became very relevant, but not only for us, but it has to be relevant to the communities. And a question that I asked myself many, many times, how can we make the museum necessary? How can the museum be an institution that is necessary for the living of many communities? And perhaps if I was brave enough, I would have said the necessary museum, but we haven't get there yet. We will. But I wanted to just highlight, for instance, the necessity of being relevant and looking at this project, which has to do with the way in which our this project with Teresa Lanceta, Nicolas Maleve, the members of the educational team at MACBA, and the professors and students of high school, Miquel Tarradell, very near to us, in which they, for 3 years, research around the neighborhood, the different communities, and create this map, which is still, you can access to it, where we see more about the community that surrounds us, and that is absolutely important. And we need to think about how, for instance, the need of the Pakistani community can fit into the agenda of the museum without creating a necessary space that is tokenistic or that it creates a niche culture. And this way, for instance, for me, art is always the answer. And Burusha Halili, for instance, the artist that we have now a presentation until the end of the month, have this approach to image making, but also to the legacy of what had constituted the work and the making and the knowledge sharing of communities, for Maghrebi communities, for instance, and also communities of the, let's say, all the inhabitants of countries that were fighting independence, right? And how the post-colonial imaginary is embedded in all those elements, and how not only we are looking at history to consider what happened, how they fought for anti-imperial hegemonic powers, against hegemonic powers, but also what is the legacy of that, of all those movements, of all that culture, of all that knowledge in the present and to the future. Another important issue for us is that as a museum, we are rooted in a context and in a sense, in a way that is both metaphorical and literal. And the way that we have addressed that also could be for instance, I'm looking at the time and I'm like rushing. The work that we do with Marina Monsonis, a collaborator for the past 5 years with the museum in something that is called La Cuina, the kitchen, where she gathers through food, through knowledge that is, let's say, brought out and transferred through food and through cooking, in the space of the museum, communities that are in the immediate environment to the museum, but also through the Queen Oberta, people around the world that talks about not only cooking, but also what entails, all the sociopolitical and economic elements that are behind culture and food. The same way is to think about how we deal with the spaces that are adjacent to the museum, how we think about what it means to belong to MACBA, what it means to the sense of the appropriation. I always say that if people will appropriate the museum, no? as the skaters appropriate the square, we will be talking about a different MACBA. And I think this is the way forward. And I put these examples, I'm not going to put the clip because I want us to have a conversation, but it's a beautiful project that was done for the festival EM3, where it was an architectural festival where these, let's say, moving elements were left in the square, and the configurations that people did in terms of appropriating this material to create areas of play, areas of encounter, gatherings, dialogues, etc., was amazing. Another proposal that was very interesting for us that took us to think about what it means to be together in conversation with all the language of the communities that are around the museum was Seismographies of the Struggle, in which we collaborated with the National Institute of Art History in France and with curator Sayar Rahmani in a project that brought to Barcelona more than 1,000 periodicals recorded digitally that included all the the histories and also sometimes those unnoticed and undocumented histories of emancipatory struggles, and that somehow force the museum to look at itself and say, well, if we want to communicate what we are doing, which are the language we should be speaking? And we transformed that space. For the first time, it was a tryout. We haven't been able to do it again. I had to say that. But what was interesting about that was to be able to see 2 centuries of periodicals and critical journals around emancipatory struggles with spoken or written in the language that were spoken by the communities around the museum. And perhaps one of the last elements that I want to suggest here before we start our conversation is the last project that we are envisioning, which is called Jardin Ambulant. And this mobile garden is really the first attempt of the museum to provide with a space, a social space to the community. Never before MACBA has a space that, in a way, it was given to the community. And the idea is not only to provide a space, but to generate a conceptual element within the museum to consider co-production, shared responsibilities, and re-articulation of what the museum should do and how it should operate to provide communities with a space that is permeable to their needs. And that is also critical in our doing. And somehow I always like this piece by Jan Perowski, that situates, and as you know, Claire Bishop's book, this radical museology, that situates we the people at the center, we the people as a shelter, we the people as infrastructure, as Abdul Malik Simon will say, as the capacity to live among us, to produce institution in a different way. And with that, I'm going to leave you with a presentation of our project, and I'm going to thank you. Let me see if I can do this.
Thank you. Mic's on. Thank you so much, Elvira. Thank you for taking us on a journey through the land of possibilities and museums. It was absolutely fantastic. I'm sure you'll agree. I do want to take some questions from the audience. So can you please think, I'm going to take 3 questions from the audience. What are the questions that you want to pose to Elvira and to the whole conference about the possible museum? And while you're thinking of that, I've got lots of questions. And one of them was from that very first quote about professional historians versus really the public and communities. And it also linked to that later comment that you made about the difference between giving access to communities and being relevant and the danger of tokenism. And the question really is about participation and participatory research in the museum. It's still who gets to decide the research question, because I think often in museums we decide a nice fancy research question and then we include the audience in that conversation. What's your approach?
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you so much. I think you're absolutely right. One of the key issues that we decided for, particularly the mobile garden, is that we won't ask those questions. We won't say, what do you need? We just give a space. It's a space of shared responsibilities, and the community had to say not only what happened there, but that's a platform to give voice to things that could happen in the rest of the building of the museum, but also in the square, to think about how one can, because it is problematic, as you said. For instance, we are also trying to organize, and we are in the process to do so, a youth council. And again, the colleagues that we had talked to, for instance, Martí Manén, the director of Indes, from which I've been in conversation in order to do this project with the team. One of the things that we have said is to think about ways in which we incorporate these youth in the making, in the decision making of the museum, no? Because what normally happens is that at the end of the day you are as extractivist as other systems in our cultural landscape or our political and economic landscape, no? And I think the important part here is that you provide a platform for those voices to be heard. The same with the team. The first 6 months probably I spent with the team was asking them, what do you think the museum should be? And some of them had never been asked that question. And perhaps it's the most difficult way to address, for instance, transdepartmental work, or even, it's not as an assembly. At the end of the day, I'm the director, but I have a team of experts in many things, but also I have a team of people that is enthusiastic, that have their own dreams, and that are looking for opportunity for their voices to be heard. So the idea is that you create a platform in which those spaces of dialogue, spaces of encounter, and spaces of proposition take place.
I love that. And I think often in museums that we forget that the whole team, and I know you mean the whole team, front, back of house, no matter what the job title, but I think we forget that those people, those individuals come from communities too, and can bring their experience in, and that's very valid. Can I see if anybody from the audience has questions that they'd like to put to Elvira, or thoughts on some of the range of possibilities of museums that they would like to share?
Yes, hello, Councillor Ian. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's very enlightening. I'm thrilled with what you said, that we need to be relevant as museums. And my question is, how do you assess what communities need in terms of your museum program?
How to assess what communities need? Thank you. Well, the way that we do it is through a process of dialogue. So one of the reasons why Jardí Ambulant started was because the museum have been in conversation with the neighborhood for some time. We do a lot of educational activities, but the impression that we have is that we are not reaching as much farther as we want, right? That kept me thinking. We have been doing that. That's the reason why, you had to bring chaos at some point, because one of the issues is that if we are doing things with the community, but the community doesn't know, or certain people in the community, or is addressed to, a group, or the families or the schools, right? How then? What this is for? And so we needed to hear them, and there was no platform to do that, except for, whatever is like that, where I will walk, and it happens to me this morning, walking to here, somebody stopped me and asked me, can you do this or that? No, in the neighborhood, can you talk to the city hall so they will change this or that in the square? That I have these conversations every morning, but we needed a more sustained way to address that, and the Jardí Ambulant became a vehicle for that. Jardí Ambulant, imagine, we have a similar space like this. We have a convent. I don't know if you saw in the first image that I show you, MACBA, new building by Mayor, is surrounded by two other buildings, and one is a convent from the 15th century. And in that convent, there is what it was called La Sala Gran, no? The big salon, which is a medieval salon as well. And we divide it. So then part of that is already for the community. And from there, we are generating a garden space that will take on some areas that are now not in use. And the idea is that through those conversations where people can speak freely about what they want, what they like, how they would like for the museum to be more permeable, what are the other things that the museum could do to be more democratic and open to their needs, it's one of the platforms that we assess. And we will do so not only in a quantitative, in a value term or in a quantitative term, but also in terms of the the content, right? Like they will bring content to this while they're doing that. No? For now, we have had some conversations around, they have sometimes gathering, no? Their own gatherings of different communities. We, of course, are part of the boards of some of the major networks of different communities. So there are different ways of assess that link with the community, but I will say, and I will hope that Jardí Ambulant will be a space in which that is not only assessed, but is constantly happening. So that constant happening will be, for me, the best assertion of the, let's say, the rightful, so the ongoing process, right?
Yeah, and I guess you could really see the outside space being relevant to communities and people who move through it, and it's bringing that into the inside space, a really interesting concept. Are there any more questions from the audience or any thoughts on possible museum futures?
Hello. One of the quotes you talked about resisting the avant-garde impulse to...
We can't hear. It's working, but we can't hear.
Oh God, that is loud, isn't it? In one of the quotes, you talked about resisting the avant-garde impulse to burn things down, to start again, versus the conservative impulse to, I guess, kind of just go on.
I'm really sorry, but I don't know if you can come to the front. It's really bad.
The acoustic's a bit difficult. Sorry to put you on the spotlight. Thank you. You can share with us. There you go. Perfect.
One of the quotes, you talk about resisting the avant-garde impulse to start again, to burn things down, versus the conservative impulse to stay the same. You know, in this conference, we're talking about kind of urgent change. How do you walk the line in that situation?
That's a great question, because of course, one of the things of the Possible Museum is the analysis of the framework of possibility. So what is the framework of possibility for me to operate, for the team, for the communities, etc. And for us was very important, because I think MACBA in particular has a great time under Manolo Borja, which I say my love. But then that somehow persists in the idea that the museum should be somehow that, or should go back to that moment. No? And neither is the museum the same that when Manolo was there, but the context has already changed dramatically. No? There are much more museums, there are more foundations, there are many collectors, and artists, of course, are finding both opportunities outside of the museum, but want to also cultivate the love for MACBA, because, of course, MACBA is the public space for contemporary art practice. And for us, the key thing was to say, okay, we have a history, but let's overcome it. No? It's almost like we needed to kill the father in a Freudian way, if you know what I mean. So there is the most important part for us was to engage with that was working, but also to look at what was invisibilized by the museum itself. And as I said before, to be coherent between, a museum that want to be, against the neoliberal world, but it has to understand that it's a neoliberal institution, and it's part of that economics, right? So how can you make it more democratic, understanding all those complexities? And I think the main issue is to open it up to communities, understanding that, of course, there is a power relation and a hierarchy, of course it is, but you create a space in which those organically, hopefully, those voices will take place. But you had to provide a platform for that to happen. We did that with the museum. We also are changing the way that we work internally. When I arrived to the museum, I was able to change the mechanism of the organizational chart. We are working much more transdepartmentally. We also open up to the different protocols that help us with not only the team, but also with the communities. So it's about meandering this, but also accepting the complexity. I didn't, talk about alphabetization in a digital term, no? But I think that's also something that happened. No, if you want to have a museum in the future, you have to digitalize. But maybe the key thing here is to accept that we are analphabet. No, we don't have the right way, or we can bring with us people that also doesn't understand the digital world in the same way, right? To create spaces in which those things are somehow malleable. That's very important. Thank you. Thanks for coming here.
Yeah, if anybody else wants to join us on stage, feel free. We're permeating different spaces. I just had one question that's linked to that, really, about how do you reconceptualize the possible museum? And one of the quotes talks about hierarchies in museums, and you referenced that there, and being very top-down, and the sort of heroic leadership models that sometimes we get in institutions. And I think sometimes they're based on collection hierarchies and the way that museums have come together in the past. And you gave a really great example in one of the images of physically disrupting that through the artworks. So it was just an extended question about how do you also manifest that disruption within the space?
Well, there are two other things. Thank you for the question. There are two other things that are important for us. One, in terms of disrupting the dramaturgy, which is like how you move around the museum. But also, as you said first, sometimes collection by disciplines, for instance, it creates a hierarchy. Of course, in museums, exhibitions are the kings, right? Because, of course, they have more budget, imply everybody, etc. But one of the things that for us is important, and is going to be highlighted probably better in our new website, is that sense in which there is no hierarchy also of the importance of the activities. So an exhibition and a workshop with kids in the neighborhood will have for us the same esteem, right? And I think that's also first and foremost important. But also another key thing, I don't know if you noticed, how many of you have been in MACBA? Now I'm going to do my statistics. Oh, very bad, very bad. What is going on? Okay, everybody, so I think you can go for free with this, so just try. It's very good, you had a good time. No, come on, you had to visit it. But anyway, apart from that, one of the things, when you go to MACBA, one of the things that you notice is that in the atrium of the museum, the atrium of the mayor building, from the ground floor, you cannot see the street. You can only see it by two different areas, right? And one area is the beginning of the ramp. And I think Mayor, I had never talked to him, but I think Mayor was thinking, okay, so you see the square, and you start going up the ramp to what the museum promised, this promise of the museum that is taking you into a different time, a different era, with these fabulous objects, right? You go up, and with that, you disengage from the space. And we thought to invite a beautiful, fabulous artist called Luz Broto, she's an artist from here, to do a project with us. And she said, okay, I want to do one project because I love this project. It's called A Wall. And she had done it before in other spaces. And it's a wall that merges, for instance, two columns or pillars, right? And what she does is to build a wall that separates us, that in this case will separate us from the audience to this Congress. So what we had done with her is to invite her to do that. So she's building a wall that will somehow close in around a year or so. So it's progressing. Now we have like the first part of the wall is built, and she's gonna continue to build that until the wall will block completely the access from the ramps to the museum, right? Which for us is also a way to say, like disrupting the access, but also to give the ramps a different meaning. And of course, you will still go to the exhibition halls through different other journeys, right? To the museum, which is also very interesting because, of course, you will see part of the museum you never see. But that's another of these beautiful ways in which we disrupt not only the dramaturgy of the museum, but also its own architecture.
I think we're out of time now, but that's a fabulous point on which to end. Thank you so much for bringing the possibility of a different type of museum and space to this conference. Please join me in saying thank you to our keynote.
Thank you.